Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Kristen, and here we explore an experiential approach to manifestation, or as I like to call it, the law of reflection. In today's video, I am going to be answering some of the most common questions that I get about my approach and what informs what I teach. I do get a lot of questions about this quite often, so I'm going to make this into a series. Otherwise, it's going to be an extremely long video. But if you do have any questions that you would like me to answer, feel free to leave them in the comments, but I will answer them in the form of a video rather than a written response. One of the most common questions that I get is, what was my spiritual journey like? So, firstly, we're using the word journey quite loosely here because, as we know, it's not really a journey, but the appearance of one. But for the sake of answering this question and just telling you a little bit more about myself, I have always come from a spiritual background. So I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. So I always had a concept of God. I also grew up in a household where we did things like tarot, we believed in things like psychics, astrology, things like this, even though that doesn't necessarily go with the Roman Catholic religion and it was kept a little bit hush hush. I've always been exposed to some kind of spirituality. So when I got a little older and I was taking my spiritual journey more seriously, I actually started off with Zen Buddhism. And that was kind of my entry point into this work. Um, when I found manifestation, this was more in my early 20s. And when I came across the teachings, I was very much in the same position that I think a lot of people are in when they find manifestation. I didn't like my life at the time. I was very unhappy and I wanted to change it. And I thought that manifestation was the answer to that. I was struggling financially. I was working a job that I didn't really enjoy. I felt disconnected from my true purpose in life. I wasn't really sure what that was. I was carrying a lot of trauma. I had pretty severe PTSD. I was chronically depressed. And I was also in a long-term relationship that was unfulfilling, but I was too afraid to leave it. I also wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, but this felt like a pipe dream for me, especially as someone that grew up in a small working class town in the north of England that nobody had ever heard of. So when I started to learn about manifestation, I saw it as a way to change my life and solve my problems. And I thought that if I manifested certain desires that I would be happy because I believed that happiness was outside of me, and that I could attain it by manifesting certain desires. So I started to implement the teachings of manifestation. I wasn't following any one particular school of thought. I had read The Secret. I was into some of the more law of attraction style teachings, like Abraham Hicks, for example. I also followed Neville Goddard. And I kind of just went with what resonated at the time, which was really just a mix of all of these different schools and different ideas. And I started to see results pretty quickly. In a matter of just a few months, I won a PhD scholarship, a place on a PhD program, and I was then going to be spending a year fully funded in Hollywood to make my documentary film. So, with my academic background, I actually trained as an anthropologist. My interests were phenomenology, human consciousness, the effective nature of desire, which is essentially what I'm teaching now, and of course, ethnographic filmmaking. And although I was definitely passionate about this, it still didn't feel like my true purpose. And as I went deeper into my research for my thesis, the boundaries between my spiritual beliefs and my academic research started to blur. And this wasn't really accepted or supported in the academic field. So over time, although I had manifested this opportunity, it still didn't feel like the right fit for me. And this is also when I started the website I Am Love, which is where many of you might know me from. And I invited the wonderful, beautiful Jennifer to run it alongside of me. She now runs that full time and she has for many years. Her work is wonderful. And then I found myself in this position as a teacher or a manifestation coach. Although, if I'm honest, I don't really care for these labels, although I realize I have to call myself something. So during my time in Hollywood, I then left my old relationship and I wanted to manifest a really great love, something different than what I had had before. I wanted my next relationship to be the person that I would marry, and it was. I met him within about a month of focusing on that desire, and then did go on to marry him later on. Although back then, I will admit I still had quite an idealized concept of what love was, which was still flavored from a space of trauma within myself. But I will say that this love did awaken me in ways that no other desire has. And it was actually the catalyst for the kundalini awakening that I would then experience a few years later. So the kundalini awakening was the most pivotal point in the journey for me. Um, I like to think of my journey as before Kundalini and after Kundalini. There's very much a marked difference. And this experience, it took me from the theoretical understanding of what it means to awaken to the direct experience of myself as God, of myself as oneness, and what it truly means that there is no separation. And I could see that the theoretical understanding of being God is very different from the actual experience of that, the mystical experience of that. And I could see that a lot of the teachings in the manifestation community were not really coming from the experiential understanding, but more the intellectual understanding, and what was being taught was more like the ego trying to play the role of God. And this is also when I started to question a lot of the teachings in the community because I could see how distorted and reductive they were. I started to talk about solipsism and how this had been mistaken for oneness, which is a conversation that is widely accepted now. However, at the time, I had a very poor reception when I spoke about that in the community and received a lot of inflammatory messages. But I could see how the manifestation community, it was using manifestation as a fix to solve problems, or because we think that manifesting desires is going to make us happy. So we have this conditional form of happiness that is only there when the desire is present. And when if the desire is not present, then that happiness is then on hold. But the main critique that I had of the community was how far removed the teachings are from the wider context in spiritual awakening that they're actually a part of. The teachings are more about spiritual materialism and trying to get things and playing the role of God rather than the true purpose of what manifestation really is, which is that our desires are a breadcrumb trail leading us back home, back to the union or realization of ourselves as God. The desire to receive love from another is also just a call to realize that love is already who you are. My Kundalini awakening experience, it completely altered my understanding of manifestation. Shortly after that, anything that was not really in alignment with what myself was transforming into began to fall away, often in quite a dramatic, chaotic way. I left my PhD program to focus on full devotion to the divine and offering these teachings. And sometime after that, my marriage also came to an end. This was a beautiful, very transformative experience, by the way, but I will talk about that in another video. So, really, the journey up until this point was one of building up and acquiring and gaining all of this knowledge and attaining these manifestations. And then it was one of letting go. And I eventually came back full circle. So, what informs my approach and where do I get my teachings from? So, my teachings are not based in theory or things that I've read, although I am widely read and I do have a passion for reading books or literature in from all pathways, purely because I just love this work so much. But my teachings come directly from my experience, particularly the Kundalini awakening, where I experienced myself as God and had the direct experience of oneness. And although I've spoken about this experience in the past, I haven't really used the term Kundalini to describe my work up until today. And I think now is the time for me to be more explicit that what I teach is the Kundalini path. This is actually something that I decided yesterday. So, as you can see, as the divine inspiration comes, I go with it straight away. But there were several reasons why I have shied away from this label. So, the first one is that I don't want to teach people how to induce a Kundalini awakening or buy into this idea that people need to have a Kundalini awakening in order to manifest. This is absolutely not true, nor do I suggest trying to induce it yourself. Some people who follow this path might not have that experience in this lifetime, and that is absolutely okay. It does not make their journey inferior and someone who has had the awakening experience superior at all. And I believe that we can benefit from Kundalini teachings if they resonate with you, even if you don't directly have the full awakening experience in this life. I also didn't want to encourage people to see me as superior or enlightened because of this experience. It's not a pedestal that I wanted to be on. I also wanted people to have the experience of awakening to our true nature without the preconceived ideas of what Kundalini is. There are a lot of horror stories, especially on the internet, that can make us go into fear. But really, Kundalini is nothing to be afraid of, even though it is quite an intense experience, just to say the least. Also, in the past, I admit that I did have quite a few fears about what people might think or say if I was to be explicit about teaching from the Kundalini path. And although I knew it was just a reflection, that there is no one outside of me thinking or saying anything, I was afraid of experiencing that reflection regardless. Of course, I still did experience that reflection in the form of people saying I was irresponsible for mentioning a Kundalini awakening, that Kundalini is dangerous, that what I'm teaching is dangerous. But these are fears that I left behind. And lastly, the Kundalini awakening was an extremely intense experience for me, and it took me quite a few years to fully integrate it. A lot of things in my life fell away. I went through a lot of emotions. I went through a lot of stories of trauma from the self arising. It took me quite a few years to get to the point that I would be comfortable teaching it. And the time is now. After my Kundalini awakening, I started to explore the link between Kundalini and manifestation. And I believe there is one because when we consciously manifest, we are intentionally working with that creative life force energy. We are awakening to ourselves as God. A nice poetic way of describing this would be that the God within us starts to stir. And this can cause the Kundalini energy to rise or activate in some people, or in some cases, a total awakening. And because most of the teachings in the manifestation community are about getting desires and they're removed from the wider spiritual context that manifestation is a part of, if someone does experience an activation or a full-blown Kundalini awakening, they're going to be quite unprepared for it, just like I was. Many of today's manifestation teachings are based on the work of the late mystic Neville Goddard, who also had a Kundalini awakening himself, even though he didn't describe it in those words. But this is what informs his later work, The Law and the Promise. And it's funny because in his earlier works, he actually mocks Kundalini and refers to it as a load of nonsense, but then goes on to have a Kundalini awakening later in life, which he describes in The Promise. And although I'm not a Neville Goddard teacher and I don't teach the law of assumption, I do respect his work. And I feel it needs to be read as a whole in order to be understood properly. And I personally don't feel that the manifestation community currently does that. I think that it cherry picks the parts of his work that fit their notion of what they think manifestation is. But really, his work represents a progression in the evolution of his awareness. And in my opinion, his later work is much more accurate and more profound than his earlier work, which is what most of the teachings in our community are based on. And not only that, they're also a reductive version of his early teachings. Another reason why I have decided to fully embrace the label of Kundalini now is because as of late, my work has been mistaken as the non-dual teaching. So I think it is now important for me to make that distinction. So, firstly, I completely respect and completely agree with non-dual teachings. And there is a lot of overlap with my work and the non-dual essence. But I don't think that non-duality is superior or a higher approach. And I think it's very easy to buy into that idea that it is. It's just one pathway to God. Kundalini is another. And there are many, many more. None of them are better than the other. We are now seeing more teachings in the community where what is being taught is actually a superficial version of non-duality that is being married with manifestation teachings. And I say superficial because it's not pure non-dualism, it's quite surface level. For example, the teaching that we are God and that all is consciousness and that there is no separation does not necessarily make that work non-duality, even though this concept of oneness is the foundation of the non-dual path. This is also the foundation of many other paths. So, for example, kundalini and non-duality both share the concept of oneness and that we are God. However, whereas non duality moves away from the identification of the self in order to realize oneself as God, Kundalini transmutes and transforms it in order to reach the exact same realization. I also want to point out that the manifestation community is always changing and evolving, and it goes through trends. And I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, but we used to have a lot of teachings about changing thoughts. Then it changed to changing your state. And now the current trend is marrying the non dual teaching with manifestation teachings. But just because a teaching is talking about oneness does not actually mean that the person is teaching non-duality, even if that is the label that they put on it. So a lot of non-dual manifestation teachings, in my opinion, they're not non-dual, they're just teaching oneness. Because if they still are teaching about changing your self-concept, which is still over-identifying with the self, then technically they are still teaching through separation as well. Teachings about trying to change somebody, trying to get somebody to be the way that you want them to be, or to manifest them differently. Again, it's teaching through separation, no matter how much you use the word oneness or the sentiment that you are God. So that is it for this video. I will be answering more questions in the next one. So if you do have them, leave them in the comments below. And I hope you enjoyed this and I hope it helps.